The successful completion of G20 Summit in the national capital was marked by a joint declaration by all member states. While that was clearly a successful summit that was held here, the G20 declaration of New Delhi was an important one. Amidst all the hectic diplomatic developments, many questioned the sidelining of Canada at the G20 Summit. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. This comes after Trudeau skipped the President's G20 reception for leaders and gave two big announcements amiss. Drawing wedge between the two countries is the stinging issue of Sikh separatism, or the so-called Khalistani movement, the anti-India narrative that has run amok on the Canadian soil. Two recent instances can be cited as the latest example: the desecration of Durga Temple at the Surrey Town County in Canada, and also the so-called referendum that was held at the same county. Both point out to the sinister designs at play. With a cold shoulder meted out to Trudeau and a strongly worded statement that had come out after that crucial meeting, this is a clear insistence on controlling the anti-India hate-mongering in Canada. Has India, with that clear statement, drawn a red line, and is it likely to have a real implication on what has happened so far? Our focus on Viewpoint.
Obviously, Canada will always defend freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of peaceful protest. That's something that's extremely important to us. At the same time as we're always there to prevent violence, to push back against hatred.
Vasudev Kutumbakam indeed was our motto, but not for certain nations, keeping in mind that this is a strong issue that India has taken up, and it has taken up with a lot of force, and in that narrative there are no words that were minced at all. Let's get you an overview of the talks between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Justin Trudeau. What exactly happened and what was said in that particular statement. India has put out its side very, very categorically, clearly, as I said, without mincing any of the words. Let's take you through those statements one by one. While Trudeau in his response has used the obvious words which he has been using in a part of his narrative, believe in the freedom of speech, he spoke about peaceful assembly, democratic rights, and as for Indian government and Prime Minister Modi's message was that forces promoting secessionism need to be controlled. Violence has been incited against the Indian community and also the community which is not really a part of this anti-India narrative, often called the silent majority living on Canadian soil. Trudeau in his statement has said that we will push back against hatred, but at the same time he continues to point against the right to peaceful assembly or the right of certain groups to have their point of view. Action of few, not of Canada, trying to distance themselves, not to forget that a lot of these hate mongers or the supporters of Khalistan are actually in alliance with the present government in the country of Canada. The Indian community is threatened, and we saw those multiple instances of desecration, diplomats, officers who were facing threat and intimidation at various points in time. Trudeau has also said that we believe in the rule of law. India has insisted that the ties are anchored in the respect of law and, more importantly, the respect for sovereignty. The particular issue of Khalistan is not about a particular community or a region. It directly goes to the heart of India's sovereignty, integrity, territorial integrity, more importantly. Trudeau also insisted, Canada also insisted in its statement that they spoke about the foreign interference. They said there are various nations which are trying to meddle in the internal affairs of Canada, saying that all these groups, whatever they're doing on Canadian soil, is actually an internal affair and you shouldn't be bothered about that. India doesn't agree with that position. The nexus must concern or everyone, including Canada. That's what India has asserted. And in that very short statement, if you read it, the biggest paragraph talks about how the Canadian authorities need to act tough when it comes to these Khalistani elements who have been running amok when it comes to their hate propaganda, the so-called referendums that have been held. Let's talk about some more facets of what exactly is happening, and more importantly, what is Trudeau's link with this Khalistani nexus. In 2015, four members of the Trudeau's cabinet, they were linked to the Khalistani nexus. There are various reports and journalistic accounts that argue that is there some kind of financial linkages that the government has. Not to forget that politically they are in alliance with a party which has a sympathetic tone towards the Khalistani cause. In 2017, attended Toronto Kirtan with Khalistani flags which were part of that Kirtan. These Khalistani elements seem to have a control of Gurudwaras and a lot of religious places, and more importantly, that has led to this small group of people being so vociferous or being so vocal. In 2017, also addressed Khalsa Day parade with Bhindranwale floats. Now, Bhindranwale, you'd remember, he's remembered for the 1984 Operation Blue Star and the sort of insurgency we had seen in the state of Punjab back in the 1980s. And he remains a deeply controversial figure here in India. 2022, about a year ago, he struck a deal with pro-KNDP to stay in power till 2025, and this alliance stays in power till 2025. So this narrative is indeed going to find some resonance with the present government in the country right now. Let's cut across to some latest news coming in on this particular topic. We also see how Trudeau is facing the flag back home. The Toronto Sun has headlines, and I'm putting those headlines in quotation marks for you. Trudeau finds that he has few friends at the G20 Summit in India. It's a sort of snub that he's got, and the snub is indeed noticed at home as well. The domestic press in Canada taking note of how this entire, at the summit, Trudeau Canada was really treated. The Globe and the Mail, which are the other publications there, have said that Modi scolds Trudeau over Sikh protests in Canada against India. These are the leading publications. In fact, various opposition parties in the country of Canada have also questioned the government about the manner in which Trudeau was snubbed and he couldn't really voice the opinion of the Canadians at the G20 Summit. So there's a domestic political backlash that Justin Trudeau is facing right now. Let's take this question to our guests as well. The success of G20 and the issue of Canada and the Khalistani issue that India has taken up very, very strongly. Joining us on the broadcast is Manju Seth, who is a former diplomat. She is with us on the show. We also have Edward P. Joseph with us on the show, who is a senior fellow at the SAIS. We also have Neha Bansal, who is a senior policy specialist at the United Nations. We also have Lieutenant General KJ Singh, who is a retired officer, also a defense analyst. Good evening to all of you. Thank you everyone for joining us on the broadcast. Manjuji, I want to come to you first. G20 indeed was a huge success. We have spoken about this in the last 4 to 5 days, ever since there has been this marathon diplomatic hectic parleys that have been happening, especially here in the national capital. But that strongly worded statement from India when it comes to the meet or the bilateral that had happened with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, what does it show about the relationship between the two nations? Is it correct to say that India has taken up this issue with far more strength and vigor compared to what we had done in the past?
Absolutely. It was very important that India take it up strongly, because despite all the threats and all what has happened in the recent past in Canada, even targeting Indian diplomats, the Indian ambassador, and kind of death threats, etc. So that has been very, very concerning for India, and Canada doesn't seem to have taken any cognizance of that.
Yeah.
They seem to be just saying, even now he gave a very anodyne kind of thing, saying we stand against them and we respects free speech, but threatening people and giving death threats is not something that you should tolerate as free speech, not under the garb of free speech. So definitely the relationship is under strain, and even the FTA talks have been put on hold because of Canada's attitude. The Canadian Prime Minister's attitude, and I think he has his constraints. Because as you mentioned just now, there is a K nexus within the cabinet as well, and his political support. A lot of it comes from that category. So not all Sikhs in Canada are linked with this or with this movement, but yes, it's a sizable chunk, and I think it is important. It is incumbent on the government of Canada to take action against them, to prevent this kind of behavior, and the threats especially to our diplomatic premises, to our diplomats. It has to stop. And even the desecration of temples, I think, is not acceptable all the time. He said we don't tolerate hate, but this is hatred. If you keep on desecrating other people's religious places, I think it is a very clear indication that this is hate. And no action, no concrete action has been taken against any of them.
Yeah, I'm going to zoom more into this Khalistan issue, India-Canada issue, and then talk about the macro issue, the success at G20 and what to expect more. I want to cut across to Lieutenant General KJ Singh, who is with us on the broadcast. Sir, you've written about this issue at length. It's a silent minority of people in the country of Canada which are very quote-unquote vocal or loud or make too much noise about this anti-India propaganda that they seek to run for certain small benefits. But the majority of the Sikh population living in Canada arguably is not in support of the so-called Khalistani movement. The fact that there are domestic political compulsions for Justin Trudeau to in some way be in alliance with the sort of narrative, do you really see this position shifting? Look, there's flag that he's got at G20, whatever he could, and the domestic press has noted that. There is domestic political flag that he's facing, and more importantly, the national media in Canada has also taken a note of it.
See, Anusha, I do not expect, great move forward, but I certainly expected better sort of behavior. The way Premier Trudeau sulked through this summit, it was not behoving his stature. He represents such a big economy, a country which has got such large diaspora from India. Their education economy runs on us.
Yeah.
A large number of Indians contribute to their economy. So I certainly expected a better kind of a response, more mature response, I'll say. See, he came here a few years back, and that time also he went on a kind of a sightseeing trip and he indulged in a lot of tourism. So this time we were expecting something substantial from him. Unfortunately, that is not happened. And you're very right. I am in touch with a lot of people in Canada. The silent majority there is not with him. And I hope what PM Modi has done is registered by others over there. Because after all, it's a democratic country. And they have to face elections. So
Yes.
it's time for people take note of this. And not, see, the problem with him is there is one Jagmeet Singh Dhaliwal. Jimmy is running the National Democratic Party. He is his coalition partner. In his own cabinet, there are 3 or 4 people who have known linkages. And it is good that we have done it. Pull aside is a format where you call a person aside, a dignitary aside, and straight away get on to the topic. There is no beating around the bush.
Yeah.
So we had to do it because, see, it has got what is happening in Canada resonates backward. Pujewala, who was killed, the people who killed him somewhere have linkages in Canada.
Yes, and in fact, sir, combating terrorism is one thing that global peace and security is something that has been spoken of in that particular joint statement as well that has come out. I want to cut across to Edward P. Joseph as well, who's with us on the broadcast. Edward, when you look at the G20 summit, the key tangibles, the key deliverables, what has been achieved through this historic summit and the joint declaration, there is a talk of the corridor which starts from here in India right up to the heart of the Western Europe. It's being hailed as some sort of alternative which has been presented by this particular platform against the Belt and Road Initiative. Would it be correct to say that perhaps some players at G20 would not be very excited about it, or perhaps the fact that it has been agreed upon? There have been reports, say the Chinese media has reported that the Chinese are not very happy with it. 2 occasions on which Canada was not present when major announcements were being made. So that leads me to the questions that, do you sense an equal amount of enthusiasm vis-a-vis this particular project that has been announced?
Of course not. No, of course not. And I think this corridor, it's a great question to ask because it's really the pivotal element of this G20, and it's the pivotal element of India's success in stage managing the G20, because this is really the pivot point is China. And this is where Prime Minister Modi has been able to be quite skillful by positioning himself as the corridor. Let's use that term really as the metaphor here, because he's positioned himself as the corridor between the United States, along with the European Union and the rest of that G20 bloc that is more ambivalent and has different positions towards China.
Yeah.
And India, of course, itself has its own very serious concerns and differences with India, including some that potentially could come to direct and have brought direct clashes.
Yeah.
So what Modi has done here is he is skillfully positioned India as a leader in managing the question and the relationship of China, of the United States, European Union, with the rest of the G20 bloc.
Right.
And we see this as well in the bilateral emphasis here that President Biden, the emphasis that President Biden took on the direct meeting with Prime Minister Modi. This was quite significant. And of course, China doesn't like any of this because this is competition to Belt and Road Initiative. And it comes at a time of when China is facing severe economic concerns. Please.
Neha, you've been patiently listening to this discussion, and that leads me to the question that Edward rightly said that, of course, all countries are not equally excited about this moot project that has been announced. How do you see the position of Canada vis-a-vis this particular project, the absence of Trudeau when this was being announced? How should that be really construed?
So Anusha, I want to start with something that you said, the success of the G20.
Sure.
And we must remember that the G20 is a multilateral forum for economic cooperation. It isn't a forum for geopolitical competition. And therefore, I would separate, the whole issue that you're talking about with regard to Canada and Khalistan from the success of the G20.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that is extremely crucial to maintain both the success of the G20 and really India's superb performance, and also to maintain what the G20 really stands for, which is really a platform, a geopolitical platform for cooperation.
Yeah.
Now, as you can see, it's already very difficult for us to keep our politics out of, when we sit around together. And therefore, I think I want to stress the really crucial role that India has played to keep its politics, its bilateral politics, whether with Canada or with China, outside of the room, and try and get that consensus. Now, that's the first point I want to make. The second point is that from the flow itself and on policy matters, Canada has played, the game of cooperation very, very well at 20, and we didn't see any of this play out. Of course, India playing the voice of the developing South and the global South has from time to time pushed back on some of the Western countries, whether it came to cost of finance, whether it came to infrastructure, transfer of technology, etc., and also in terms of national pathways to development. But by and large, I would stop by saying that, this geopolitics that actually plays out at almost every forum very naturally was very skillfully and,
so,
kept
Neha,
out of the...
I agree with the opening comment that you made, that, the success of G20 versus the bilateral issues that India, Canada, India, China may have are two theoretically very different topics, and yes, at the global platforms as well, ideally they should be separate. I want to just read out one of the headlines that I read. It was the headline of the Toronto Sun. It has been published. It says, Trudeau finds he has few friends at the G20 Summit in India. The optics of how these summits really play out are very, very important, not just for the leaders, for the press, but I believe for the geopolitics and for the overall, success for any particular country is concerned. How do you see this particular, manner and posture of Canada being portrayed in their national media? It's not the Indian press.
I would again go back to saying what I said earlier, which is that, for all of us, we tend to start to take our geopolitical positions very quickly, including the press in Canada. And so it's really important. I mean, I was representing the policy sort of debate at the G20, and I can tell you that didn't play out on the flow of negotiations.
All right, I want to cut across back to Manju Seth, who continues to be with us on the broadcast. Manjuji, when it comes to this particular issue, and I want to go back to G20 and how it really played out, why do you think that the international press, including the Canadian press, is of the opinion that there was some kind of a snub that was meted out to Justin Trudeau when it comes to the G20 summit? And talking about the bilateral that happened, it is very clear in the two statements that have come out that the two countries have very strong position, and India has asserted that vis-a-vis this issue, the Khalistan issue, Canada needs to act. They need to get their act together and they need to act tough on these elements.
Absolutely. G20, as mentioned, is an economic forum.
Sure.
The focus is on economics, but of course, geopolitical issues have crept in, and other elements have been added to make it a comprehensive kind of forum to address global challenges where global solutions can be found, because this G20 represents about 75% of the global GDP and a large element of the population as well.
Yes.
So percentage of the population. So the fact that Canada found itself isolated, I think, is because it seemed that they were not ready, because terrorism was an important part, and they were not ready to condemn terrorism, and because these are terrorist acts, at the end of the day, the Khalistani approach and the way they've been behaving and threatening and showing all these, tableaus, including Indira Gandhi's assassination act. That was the worst possible thing to do.
Yeah.
And yes, they have taken action for the diplomats to give them security, but that is not enough. They have to take action against the people who threatened them. They have to take action against preventing any further I don't think it's just freedom of speech when you constantly target Indian community, other Indian community members and other community members of, not necessarily, all non-Sikh community members, and no action is taken. So they know they can do, in the name of free speech.
Yeah.
So and no proper bilateral meeting was held between India's Prime Minister Modi and Canadian Prime Minister. But there was a pull aside, and yes, the statements given out were quite different. Where he said yes, it is it's freedom of speech, etc., etc. We saw all that, and where he has said very categorically that this is not acceptable, what you're saying, and you need to take action. So I think that is
I'll have one more comment from Lieutenant General KJ Singh on the particular issue of India versus Canada, and then I'll come to the overall G20 summit and to what extent it has been successful. What are the key things to look forward to? Lieutenant General Singh, when it comes to the Khalistan issue, is it correct to position it as a bilateral issue between India and Canada? India has voiced the concern that when it comes to these Khalistani elements, this pro-Khalistan network or nexus that runs, it runs across the world in US, UK, Canada, Australia, different countries. Should this be seen in the light of global threat or the kind of terror activities that we have seen? Because a lot of these elements are found to have linkages with criminal elements, terror elements, which are wanted here in India.
See, Anusha, US has put together a grouping which is called I5, which is got a grouping of UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada and USA. And that is for intelligence and this kind of exchange of information.
Yeah.
Now, the people who are operating, we have this threat from 3 countries, actually 3.5 if you take it. This thing happens largely in Canada. It also happens in UK, Australia, and to some extent in US.
Yeah.
Now, somewhere in this entire process of our flagging the issue, Australia seems to have come around and is willing to take action and is showing some activity also. And also UK, after the Colin Bloom report, UK is also showing there are compulsions because UK has also got vote bank politics inside their country. So that is also an issue for them. But UK is showing positive move forward. Now, what is left is the very, very catalyst from where everything starts, and that is Canada. And you are right, it has got ramifications across India. People of Lawrence Bishnoi gang are hiding in Canada. There are people who have, who have been involved in terrorist activity, which has killed people from multiple, nationalities, and that is still not resolved. So, to that extent, I will go along with you that don't take it only as a bilateral issue.
Yeah.
It is got ramifications into many countries, and it is time that Canada becomes serious on this issue, because
I want to have closing comments from all the guests as far as the G20 summit is concerned and the viability of what has been promised, and to what extent can it really be translated in reality. Edward P. Joseph, coming to you first. We spoke about the corridor. It's a mega ambitious infrastructure project we're talking about, which will require the cooperation of multiple countries. There are various other things that have been spoken of: financial inclusion, cryptocurrencies, MSME, private sector enterprises, biofuels, different areas of cooperation that have been identified. But to what extent do these promises actually translate into reality? The financial and the political viability of the promises made at the G20 summit.
You've put your finger on the main weakness of this type of a forum.
Yeah.
Is that translating these commitments? They're broad commitments, and we should not dismiss them. It's still significant that countries come together and say, for example, that they're going to triple their capacity in renewable energy. That's nothing to be dismissed, but realizing those commitments is another matter, and that's where, of course, it takes focus and follow-up in the aftermath of the big summit. On the question, though, the other guest mentioned about geopolitics, it's not realistic to say, oh, we have to leave geopolitics out, because that's entirely the purpose of such a forum, is to bring the political, the sometimes competing, sometimes overlapping interests of 20 different nations, 20 different significant nations, and bringing them together. And no one can expect United States or China or Russia or anyone, or India for that matter, to say, oh, well, we leave our interests at the door and we're only going to talk about renewable energy and similar things that are urgent imperatives.
Yeah.
And that's where this summit was so significant, again, for India, because it was directed, it was in significant respects, the corridor that you raised is about China. The messaging on Ukraine, this was quite controversial here in the United States, because it's seen as watering down what is, and let's come to the point here, food security, one of the key issues for the global South. Who is causing this threat, which is mentioned in the summit communique? It says they're concerned about the grain, calls on Russia to respect the UN negotiated grain deal, which Russia refuses.
All right.
These are the type of concerns that affect the global South, but there's a difference in approach in raising these issues. And I can tell you from here in the United States that did raise concerns. Please.
Naya, you can't leave the politics at the door. The geopolitics forms the undercurrent on which the economic negotiations really happen. And to divorce one from the other is to have a very limited picture of the overall reality.
So I would beg to differ, and I think that's what makes the G20 a premier platform, because here are, and I would agree to the extent that here are 20 countries plus trying to shape the global fabric based on their national positions and national interests. But there is a difference between that and geopolitics, and as I keep repeating, that is what makes the G20 so crucial and so required, frankly.
Yeah. All right, I appreciate your comments and a different point of view that you're taking. I thank all our guests for joining us on the broadcast. But yes, the thumping success of the G20 summit and the clear assertion and a critical assertion by India when it comes to the Canadian authorities, that when it comes to the Khalistani elements, they need to be tackled. This is clearly the red line that the Indian authorities have drawn.